Howdy folks, and welcome back to World of Warships with Rear Admiral Jingles, and the theme, and indeed title, of today's video is Trust Your Instincts, although possibly by the time you've seen the way this particular battle plays out, perhaps that should be do not, under any circumstances, trust your instincts, just run. Run, little destroyer, run for your life. You be the judge. This is Milano010, and he has the great misfortune to be in a Tier 8 destroyer, in fact one of only two Tier 8s on his team in this Tier 10 battle in domination mode here on the hotspot map. Although things could have been a lot worse. For a start, there are no aircraft carriers, and the two Tier 8s on his team, he's at least in a destroyer. The other Tier 8 is a Wichita, and I have to say that if I'm in a Tier 10 battle in a Tier 8, I'd much rather be in a destroyer than a cruiser. At least a destroyer can hide. But that is pretty much where the good news both starts and ends, because aside from being a Tier 8 destroyer in a Tier 10 battle, there are also three radar cruisers on the enemy team, an Alaska, a Salem, and a Baltimore. Well, he does actually have one other trick up his sleeve. With a surface detection range of 5.5 kilometers with the concealment expert skill and the concealment module, he's actually the stealthiest ship in this battle, even more so than the Shimakaze on the enemy team. But he's going to need to use all of that stealth if he's going to survive this battle, let alone win it. Now he's being followed by the friendly Minotaur, and his team does have three radar cruisers of its own, although potentially it might have four. And finding out which consumables that Minotaur's taken would be very, very useful information to have, particularly if you're charging into a cap at the start of the battle with what might potentially be a friendly radar cruiser in close support. So he asks the question there in chat, but unfortunately the Minotaur is fairly standard and is using the smoke consumable. And speaking of radar cruisers, that is incredibly bad news. It's the enemy Baltimore. The second he slips into this cap circle, the Baltimore is going to know the circle is being contested, there's an enemy destroyer in here, and he should be popping his radar. Because the enemy destroyer, the gearing over there, who he easily outspots, and who he's sharing this cap circle with, would probably really like to know where the destroyer on the enemy team is that's blocking his capture of this capture point. Because if he had, that gearing would have been in an ideal position to utterly shred him from that side, and the Z-23 would have been in the perfect position to do the same from that side and also not sail straight into this. You kind of have to feel a certain element of sympathy for the poor old Z-23. He's currently getting shredded by a Harugumo, a terrifying experience for any destroyer, and sometimes for any cruiser or battleship. And he's just run straight into this. Now, he tries to hide in the smoke, but he instantly gets radared by the friendly Wichita. The Harugumo is still shooting at him. Milano is shooting at him. The friendly Minotaur to the rear is about to get involved in the action. There's just nowhere for this guy to go. The only thing that he accomplishes through using his hydro is to not get torpedoed, but the second he dies, the hydro expires, and Milano is nice and safe inside his own smokescreen, despite taking a couple of shots when he was briefly illuminated by the Z-23's hydro. So the enemy team now know beyond any shadow of a doubt, if they didn't already, that there is a destroyer sharing this capture circle, and yet the Baltimore still hasn't used his radar. I began to wonder if he was just some kind of American cruiser hipster who was using the catapult fighter because he was too cool to use the radar. And that may very well have been the case. But then the question was answered for me. There he is, less than half health, charging straight into the cap, momentarily safe while sharing the smoke screen with the gearing over there, until he decided to reveal himself by firing his guns and charging out of the smoke screen. Hydro still running, so he sees the gearing torpedoes. But the question of what prompted that bizarre display from the Baltimore, why didn't he use his radar? Why did he just charge straight into the cap circle? Why didn't he take advantage of the gearing smokescreen? All of these questions have the same answer. He's just an idiot. He has no idea what he was doing or why he was doing it. Often the simplest solution is the correct one. There was simply a massive big pot of glue on that island, and he just had to get over there as quickly as possible to have a really good sniff. Meanwhile, Milano has emptied some, well, what are looking like very, very good torpedoes into that gearing smokescreen. Yep, he's now close enough to detect the gearing on hydro. Risks a shot, gets detected, but it's fine. He's killed the gearing. Devastating strike award, and he's able to slip into cover behind this island. And now, for the first time in this match, he's free to capture this control point without any kind of enemy interference. So while he's capping, full disclosure here, I do have to admit that when I realised he was determined to contest this capture point against what was most likely going to be a tier 10 enemy destroyer, with a radar cruiser well inside radar range, I thought that he was making a bit of an error of judgment. I have been in that situation myself, I'm sure we all have, and under those circumstances, sticking around and contesting the cap is almost always the wrong idea. And yet, well, there's a famous expression that applies here. Professionals are predictable. It's the amateurs that you have to watch out for. Nobody could have predicted that the Baltimore would turn out to be such a window licker. And if he had done the sensible thing and gotten the hell out of Dodge, the gearing would have capped uncontested and would have probably escaped without being torpedoed. Milano's instinct was to stay and contest the cap, and it turns out to have been the right thing to do. Although there's another famous expression that also applies here: if it's stupid and it works, it's not stupid. Or perhaps he just got lucky, but either way, the gearing's dead. In fact, all of the enemy destroyers are dead, along with the cruiser. This is actually going quite well. The team have 2 caps, they're well ahead on points, and they seem to have the enemy team on the run here. What could possibly go wrong? Well, things are going to get better before they get worse. Milano is now close enough to the Yamato to be proximity detected as the Kremlin beats a hasty retreat, and ironically the only reason the Yamato is there is because that Kremlin was begging for assistance in team chat, as we'll see later when the Yamato complains about it. But this is just bizarre. And that Yamato is so pissed off at the Kremlin that he came over here to support running away that he picks exactly the wrong moment to make his own break for safety. Milano has a bit of a not-so moment here as he, well, to be fair, it did look like he was going to clear the island, but he didn't. He's gotten his torpedoes away. The Yamato, who, let's not forget, is the one who proximity detected Milano in the first place, runs right into his torpedoes as he attempts to get out of there and leaves the safety of the island. So the Yamato's down, and the team are so far ahead on caps, points and kills that it's difficult to see how the enemy team could possibly win. At this point, Milano's team pretty much just have to sink another 3 ships and they're going to 0 point the enemy team. But, as I'm sure we're all aware by now, there's no such thing as a World of Warships team that isn't somehow capable of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. And while Milano, amongst others, is taking advantage of the Kremlin's distraction to rain fiery death and destruction down on him from a relatively safe position, it's at this point where things start to go somewhat pear-shaped for Milano's team. First, they lose one of their Harugamos. Oh, and there's the Yamato complaining in chat. There's a lesson that Churchill tried to warn everybody about in World War II. Never trust a Russian asking for help. Although technically Stalin was a Georgian. Oh, I'm so in trouble for that one. Oh no, then fresh disaster strikes. The team have just lost a Yamato of their own. Although if you go back and look at the minimap at the point where he was sunk and you see where he was sunk, it's really not that surprising. So, that's a couple of losses the team could have done without. But despite that, they are still comfortably ahead, and they inch even further ahead when the surviving Harugamo burns down the enemy Georgia. But this is just Milano's team lulling him into a false sense of security and superiority. The Jean Bart over there is determined to die, and the team's Montana is quite happily pursuing the enemy Zhao into the bottom corner of the map. And a Zhao is at its most dangerous when it's being pursued, because it can simply stop shooting at you, go undetected, and while you're chasing after him, you're highly likely to run into enough torpedoes to sink 12 navies. The Jean Bart is gone. There he goes. The Montana has lost most of its health, and is about to lose contact with the Zhao. That Jean Bart over there is the one responsible for the death of the friendly Jean Bart, and he is reversing. And that's going to be a bit of a problem for Milano, because the Lightning's torpedoes only have an 8-kilometer range. Which means that if you want to torpedo a target that's heading away from you, you have to get significantly closer than you otherwise would to ensure that the torpedoes have enough running time to actually make it all the way to the target. However, this Lightning has a surface detection range of 5.5 kilometers, so he closes to about 6 kilometers, pops the fish into the water, and peels the way. And as luck would have it, the Jean Bart picks that precise moment to stop reversing and starts moving forward. However, he didn't pop both spreads of torpedoes down the same line of bearing. The second spread was offset slightly to take into account the possibility that the Jean Bart might do exactly that. And then, just in case the Jean Bart didn't get the hint the first time, he pulls the old "hey, look over here, not over there" gag, a sort of modern day version of the tactic employed so successfully so many times in John Ford westerns by the Native Americans. Seriously, if you kids would just watch more classic westerns, you wouldn't fall for shit like that. As often as you do. So, where does that leave us? Ironically, the Kremlin is still intact. Much to the upset of the Yamato player, I'm sure. And despite recent setbacks, the team are still comfortably ahead. They hold 3 of the 4 caps, they have an almost 400-point lead. The Jean Bart is busy being burned down. Unfortunately, the team have just lost their Worcester, fallen victim to the enemy Alsace, who is responsible for half of his team's kills and is running up a bit of a cricket score. Still, the Jean Bart over there is on perilously low health. He is burning. It would be a shame to let him get away, and since British destroyers have such a short cooldown on the use of their smokescreen, Milano is able to keep the bombardment going on the Jean Bart with relative impunity. And then, just when you thought things couldn't get any better, the friendly Minotaur brings the enemy Alsace's rampage to a crashing halt. And so naturally it's at precisely this moment, just when it looked like the team couldn't possibly lose, that they suddenly start losing. The enemy Salem takes out the Wichita, and that Kremlin takes out the friendly Buffalo. Although, to be fair to the Buffalo, thus far, he's been about as much use to the team as an ashtray on a motorbike. And it's at this point, uncomfortably close to yet another enemy radar cruiser, that Milano decides it's time to beat a hasty retreat. It would be optimistic in the extreme to assume that all of the radar cruisers on the enemy team were merrily looking for windows to lick and pots of glue to sniff, and in fact he has been radared by the Alaska just as he takes out the Kremlin, but the Alaska is concentrating on finishing off the Harugamo, which is great news for Milano, not such great news for the Harugamo. The Jean Bart that Milano was merrily burning down takes advantage of Milano's being detected by radar to put some shots in his general direction. The Harugamo has of course been sunk, and the Alaska is now taking the friendly Minotaur under fire. The Minotaur's firing back, and Milano decides that it's worth the risk to continue his exposure in order to assist the Minotaur in putting the Alaska down. Seems like a risky choice with the Jean Bart ready to unload another salvo in his direction, but as long as the Alaska dies, and he does, he can once again go undetected because the Jean Bart is more than 12.2 kilometers away, the maximum range of the Lightning's guns. So now it's 3 against 3. Although, once again, Milano's team is still way ahead on points and still controls 3 of the caps. The Salem's gone undetected, and that's going to be a problem for the Minotaur. Although the Minotaur isn't simply sitting inside his smokescreen, he's not nearly that stupid, waiting for a Salem to get close enough to spot him, or even detect him with radar. Milano, unsure of the Salem's radar range, asks his teammates. He thinks it's 9 kilometers, it's actually 8.5. The Salem has been reacquired. You'll note that the Minotaur is beating a hasty retreat, so he's staying outside of radar range, but he's keeping the smokescreen between himself and the Salem. And with Milano spotting for him, he is able to keep putting effective fire into him. And oh, look, I'm sure you'd probably all forgotten about the friendly Montana and the enemy Zhao, and as predicted, the enemy Zhao has sunk the friendly Montana. So they're now outnumbered 3 against 2. The Salem is of course starting to flip a cap. At this point, it's really become a matter of staying alive, not squandering this points advantage and just trying to ride out the clock. Although if you can sink any more enemy ships, you know, that would also be good. Milano, with his head on a swivel, trying to pinpoint the location primarily of the Jean Bart, but also aware that the Zhao is probably going to be heading in this direction as well. Jean Bart spotted to the south, heading north, flipping one of the caps in the process. Last seen with around about 3,000 health and on fire, but in the absence of any further persecution, has managed to get his health back up to about 10,000. Milano anxiously watching the progress of his torpedoes. 2 hits, it's good, but it's not good enough. The Salem has almost certainly used his damage control. One of those torpedoes caused flooding. Now would be a really good time to set him on fire. But the Minotaur doesn't have high explosive shells. And while the Salem may have the sort of Walmart budget version of American Tier 10 cruiser radar, it does get a very, very good heal, and it's already recovered a ton of health. Also, because of the manoeuvres that the Salem undertook in order to avoid, or attempt to avoid, the bulk of Milano's torpedoes, it successfully avoided all of the Minotaur's torpedoes, and the Minotaur's torpedoes hit a little harder than the Lightning's torpedoes. If the Salem had been hit by 2 of the Minotaur's torpedoes, it probably wouldn't have survived the initial impact. Although, given the course that the Salem was sailing, it's unlikely that it would have taken 2 torpedoes in the first place. Meanwhile, down at this end of the map, things are starting to get a little bit tight for Milano in the Lightning, so he unloads some torpedoes in the direction of the Jean Bart, and then peels away to remain undetected. We've lost sight of the Zhao. Well, that's good, because it means the Zhao doesn't have anything to fire at. That's good news for the Minotaur, because coming under fire from a Salem, a Jean Bart and a Zhao would be very, very bad news for a British light cruiser. Speaking of bad news, oh, is that going to be 3? I think that's going to be 4 hits. It was 4 hits, but, well, torpedo number 4 was surplus to requirements. 3 torpedoes were all that were required to put the Jean Bart finally out of his misery. But let's not celebrate just yet, because the enemy team control 3 of the caps. The Minotaur is being crossfired by the Salem and the Zhao. I think, and apparently Milano agrees with me, that now is the moment to throw caution to the wind and assist that Minotaur in putting down that Salem. This could go either way. True, at that angle the Salem does only have 1 turret that it can fire at the Minotaur, but that turret has 3 guns that fire very quickly and hit very hard on a light cruiser. Now, he did manage to set the Salem on fire with his last salvo, but with nobody firing high explosive at him anymore, the Salem realises that it's safe to use his damage control. And unfortunately, the Minotaur has been taken out in the crossfire between the Salem and the Zhao. And even though we can't see the Zhao, we know exactly where he is. He's over there. He's just flipped Delta. So, Milano is not only the last ship left alive on his team, he's in a Tier 8 destroyer, facing 2 Tier 10 cruisers, one of whom has radar. Now, his instincts as a destroyer player, looking at an enemy team who've called dibs on all 4 of the caps, is to start flipping those caps back. However, you don't want to be hanging around in this cap circle. The Lightning is not particularly fast, although it is faster than a Zhao, and it is faster than a Salem. It's not that much faster, and unlike the premium Tier 8 destroyer, the Cossack, the Lightning doesn't get a speed boost. And that Salem is not very far away. He's just around the island to the north, and he's guaranteed to be heading in this direction, although probably somewhat cautiously given the spanking that he received from Milano's torpedoes earlier. Milano doesn't know whether or not the Salem still has any charges left on its radar consumable, but it's best to just assume that he has, rather than hoping that he doesn't and lying in wait around the corner of an island, fingers crossed, relying on dumb luck that the radar cruiser you're attempting to torpedo ambush is 1, dumb enough to just blunder around a corner, and doesn't have any charges of radar left. Instead, and to his credit, Milano is actually using his head, although he's probably not using it quite as much as he should, because he's convinced that the team have lost, despite his doing 161,000 damage in a Tier 8 destroyer in a Tier 10 battle. Despite sinking 3 of the enemy, he's just looking at the capture progress at the top of the screen, aware that the Salem has just slipped into capture point Alpha, and is undoing all of the good work that he just did. He's thinking that he has to continue flipping caps here, and he absolutely doesn't. All he has to do is stay alive, because there's less than 30 seconds of this game left. And even if the enemy were in solid control of all 4 of the capture circles, there's no way they can make up a 200-point deficit in less than 30 seconds. So even though every instinct is screaming at him to get into that cap circle, do anything, whatever it takes to slow down the rate of points gained that the enemy team are currently enjoying, he absolutely doesn't have to do it. And in fact, with seconds to go, his instincts might have gotten him killed, because flipping the cap has broadcast his location to the Zhao, who luckily for Milano doesn't have radar. Or perhaps he was in complete control of the situation, knew exactly what he was doing, and simply wanted to try to grab as many points as possible for himself before the match ended. I don't know, I wasn't there. You guys be the judge. Either way, that was a very well played game, and an incredibly close win for Milano in the Tier 8 British destroyer the Lightning in a Tier 10 battle in domination mode on the hotspot map. Hope you enjoyed it, and as always, take care, and I'll catch you next time.